Today's second half of our series on partnerships and collaborations, and today's topic is strategy and due diligence, best practices in partnerships and mergers. We're pleased to have with us today Joe Naughton-Travers from Open Minds as our presenter. So before we get started on today's topic, just a few housekeeping items to go through. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the slides and the recording will be available on the MCTAC website. We've set some time at the end of the presentation for questions, and really do encourage you to use the chat box feature throughout the webinar and chat in your questions to all panelists, and the chat box can be found in the upper right-hand corner of your computer screen. Who may be new to MCTAC. MCTAC is a training, consultation, and educational resource center that offers resources to all mental health and substance use disorder providers in New York State. And here's the MCTAC and MCTAC partner slide. This slide shows all of the MCTAC Plus partners, and the MCTAC Plus partners provide individualized and hands-on training and technical assistance to behavioral health providers throughout New York State on the successful transition to Medicaid managed care. So let's get started. Just a little bit about our presenter today. We are so pleased to have Joe Naughton-Travers with us from Open Minds. Joe has over 30 years of experience in the health and human service field. He has experience in both the private and public sector in the delivery of health and social services. And I've personally heard Joe speak on today's topic before, and he does such a wonderful job of explaining the topic in a way that's understandable and really does make it approachable. So welcome to you, Joe. And one last reminder to everyone, please do use that chat box and type in your questions to all presenters. And with that, I am going to go ahead and pass the ball over to Joe so that he can get us started for today. All right, all you.
Thank you, Daniela. This is Joe Naughton-Travers from Open Minds. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today working alongside MCTAC and MCTAC Plus to do our webinar today. As you can see from the agenda, we'll be talking a little bit more about partnership and particularly mergers for organizations. Some of you may have heard me present up in Albany where we covered some case studies and other sorts of things. Today's hour session is a little bit more in-depth, talking about where partners or mergers fit in with your organizational strategy, how to find the right partner, and I'll be talking both about an organic and a planned process. I'll get a little bit more detailed and talk about how you do an effective due diligence process when you're evaluating potential merger partners in particular. And then I actually have some sample materials from some work I've been doing in the Midwest to sort of share with you the analysis and data that's helpful when you're looking at partnership opportunities and in particular at merger opportunities. And then with a few closing thoughts, and then we'll hopefully have time for our questions for about 10 or 15 minutes. Just a reminder again, if you have questions as I'm speaking, just type them into the chat box, and my colleagues will keep track of them and will address the questions when we reach the end of my presentation. For the first section, I'd really like to talk about the big picture. You know, where do partnerships and or mergers in particular fit in with your organizational strategy? This slide is really a very big picture from our perspective at Open Minds about how strategic planning and management fits in today's healthcare environment and the key issues and steps for organizations. A large portion of my consulting practice actually happens to be strategic planning. And so the steps here really fit into the kind of work that I'm often doing with folks. At the beginning, what our role is in the healthcare environment, you know, as providers, we have to have a sense of who we are, what's our mission, and have a vision of our future competitive advantage and market positioning. And who grew up in this field are not used to that language, you know, competitive advantage or market positioning. But the notion is, as a provider of services, you know, where we fit into the healthcare market and how do people see us? The notion of competitive advantage is why would consumers or payers pick us instead of another agency down the street? So we have a clear sense of who we are, what's our mission, how we're different from other organizations and how we can leverage that, and then how we want to present ourselves in the marketplace. Step is really strategic planning, developing a plan for an organization about how it's going to move forward, particularly in the next 2 to 5 years. And as we think about the changes in the New York market, there's a lot of rapid changes going on. So I'm sure that many of you have been doing that or are doing that, which is to envision, where you're going to be in 2 to 5 years as the system of care changes, and what are the key objectives you have to accomplish in order to meet that future positioning. Once you've done step number 2, you have a clear strategic plan and objectives and a detailed timeline for how you're going to get there. Coming out of that are the notions of having detailed plans for making that happen, all your operational plans. Item number 4 is about having performance metrics to ensure that we are achieving the objectives and accomplishing our plan. Number 5 and 6 are taking a look at both our current operations and how we might optimize them or whether we need service models. And then you'll notice item number 7, and this into the planning process as well as the execution, is figuring out where collaborations or partnerships fit in to the new market vision, where we're going to fit into the marketplace. For many organizations I'm working with, we're often doing as part of step number 2, the plan process, is having a frank discussion about, do we need to partner to be successful and to achieve our mission for the years to come? Do we need to be bigger? Do we need to merge with an organization or partner or be acquired in order to continue to thrive in achieving our mission? So that's a big picture where collaboration and partnerships fit in. And the questions we're asking ourselves fit into 3 broad categories. One is about our mission, again. This comes up during the planning process. What's our mission? What are our values? What's our vision? Service delivery, I think, is the key question that New York providers need to be asking themselves right now, which is, where do we fit into the future service system? As we rearrange the system of care, moving to these regional integrated managed care models, where's our organization going to fit in, and what does our future look like for us? Can we actually thrive in the environment? What opportunities do we have? And the third set of questions are the reality check questions. Can we do this? Where do we fit in with the competition? Can we demonstrate value? Do we have the infrastructure to be successful? Do we have an attractive brand? Do payers and consumers pick us? Or do we need to do something different or partner in order to be more successful in the long run? So that of market drivers that are pushing providers to consider partnerships in some form of consolidation. And I've talked about some of them already. Certainly, in general, we're seeing a preference for service delivery models that focus on integration of primary care and behavioral health care. When you look at the data about the cost of health care, you really begin to clearly understand that consumers or individuals that have primary care and behavioral health care conditions actually cost a lot more money than individuals who only have one versus the other. And we're seeing lots of models of integration of primary care and behavioral health care in the market. The second thing that's really pushing us towards partnerships and consolidation is the shift from fee-for-service or cost-based contracting to some sort of value-based payment methodology. Whether it be base rates, bundled payments, even subcapitation or capitation, things that are much more focused on outcomes or metrics rather than just delivering services. In that, we're seeing more competitive bidding and selective contracting by payers. There is a lot of consolidation in the health plan or managed care market itself. And providers are looking for opportunities to their costs through economies of scale or greater financial strength in order to make investments. So all these things are really driving organizations to take a look at how large they are and determine whether or not collaboration or partnership, including mergers and acquisitions, need to be part of that strategy. Slide, I just have a few stats about the sort of explosion in M&A activity over the recent years. The data is 3 years old at this point, but there is clearly continued movement for merger and acquisition activity in the marketplace. CEOs see this as a long-term survival strategy, given the movement towards more value-based purchasing, more managed care, and decreased funding on all sorts of fronts. So we're getting bigger through partnership or merger or acquisition. We're looking at the notion of economies of scale. And the definition, the dictionary definition is that production becomes more efficient as the number of goods being produced increases. Again, that's a manufacturing definition, but the notion for us as healthcare providers is if we're larger, we can spread our administrative and operational costs over a larger group of services, which reduces the cost of services. So that's one of the issues that folks are always looking at is, do I need to be bigger in order to afford to operate, in order to afford, high-skilled staff or an electronic health record or other sorts of things in order to be competitive and thrive in the environment? That I would like to point out that being bigger is not a strategy in and of itself. There is a place in the marketplace for niche providers, and niche providers can be smaller providers. We don't all have to be big providers to be successful. But a niche provider has to have a service that's in demand. They're likely to be a specialist, and they need payers who are certain to pay them for the services. So perhaps if we're a specialist in working with kids with autism spectrum disorder in school settings and happen to be the best at doing that, and no one else is doing it around us, we may be able to thrive in the long run as being a specialty provider. That's one example. It could be clinical specialties. It could be, being multilingual or other sorts of things. So there is an opportunity for niche providers. We just have to think that through as part of our strategy. Do keep in mind that just being bigger or doing more of a service, it doesn't necessarily make our organization better. Being bigger is only helpful if it helps us actually reduce our unit costs of services so that we get those economies of scale, or if it just helps us gain greater market clout because we have a larger market share and we're more visible in the marketplace. Adding new services in and of themselves does not necessarily help us. It has to be adding new services through partnerships or merger and acquisition that actually makes sense for the big picture. Keep in mind that as we get larger, it becomes more challenging to make change rapidly as an organization. It's easier for a smaller organization to be nimble. Larger organizations often struggle with communication and making change just given the size of the organizations. So there really are advantages and disadvantages of being smaller or larger, and these all need to be thought through as part of our strategy. The big picture, where does the notion of partnership, and particularly mergers and acquisition, fit into our organizational strategy? So if you haven't done it already, I do encourage you to revisit your strategic plan, to revisit your mission, your vision, your competencies, what you're good at, what you struggle with, and have a vision about where you're going to fit into the marketplace in 2 or 3 years, in particular in the New York State, and figure out what you need to do to get there. Then, frankly, discuss whether partnerships or other options are part of what needs to happen in order for you to achieve that vision. When I'm working with organizations about finding partners, and I'm actually working on 3 or 4 projects now around the nation, I describe them as falling into 2 broad categories that I call organic partnerships, for lack of a better word, actually. These are opportunities that essentially present themselves. They're not a formal step-by-step process of looking for partners, the other option that I'll describe in a moment. In these instances, it may be your organization is actually approached by another organization. This happened for a customer of mine in Tennessee, where they were actually approached by an adjacent community mental health center and asked if they were interested in acquiring them. They were having some financial difficulties, and they were looking for a solution to fit for them. Sometimes it may be someone reaching out to you. In other instances, there may be changes in leadership. There may be times where a longtime CEO or other senior leaders are leaving the organization, and the board of directors may actually consider a merger or acquisition or sort of partnership as part of the plan rather than a traditional succession plan. Obviously, in the New York market, knowing the changes that are happening with our plan for regional systems of care, geographic factors obviously play a key part. So when we're looking at potential partners, whatever the partnership opportunity may be on the sort of continuum of possibilities, it's obviously likely to be someone in the geographic area, folks that would likely be considered partners because they'll end up in the same managed care geographic area. Fine, though, if we are approaching an organic partnership, we still need to go through the same process in terms of determining where it fits with our strategy, and then a lot of the due diligence and financial analysis steps that I'll be describing more in the next half hour. Organic partnership process, and my guess is there have been a number of those in New York State, and that's probably the way that many of the partnership opportunities are occurring given the geographic model that the state is moving to for managed care. But I'm going to describe the planned partnership process because keep in mind that this is a more methodical process, and in part of your strategic planning, you may also be looking for other kinds of partners, and you may choose to use this as part of your tools for moving forward. The solution here is rather than having obvious providers in the marketplace that you would approach or that they approach you, this is where you define in advance what you're looking for first. What's the ideal partner? If you're looking to be acquired or looking to acquire or looking just for a strategic partnership for a particular service line, the steps here are about figuring out what we need first and then researching to find out, well, who in the marketplace meets those needs or more closely meets those needs, and then figuring out how to approach them. On this slide, I indicate the common factors that people use to determine whether or not to determine what an ideal partner might look like, whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit, organizational size in terms of revenue, geographic locations, service lines, clinical specialties, et cetera. For example, a number of years ago, I was doing work in California State, and I was working with a large community-based provider that had made a strategic decision to expand their service line to include services for individuals with autism spectrum disorder. And they decided they didn't want to build that, and they didn't feel like they had the core competencies to just begin delivering that service. So their decision was to actually find someone to acquire. So we're very specifically looking for a for-profit provider with annual revenues between 5 and 10 million, who specialized in providing autism spectrum disorders and had a good reputation in doing so. It was in one of a certain number of counties in California. So they were very specific about what they were looking for. If you're not familiar with the California market, there's a lot of providers out there. And there were actually a lot of providers that met that criteria. And so we created a process for contacting those providers and inquiring about whether they were interested in partnership or merger. They actually ended up with 5 possible candidates and actually acquired one of them, an organization that was roughly $6 million. So I did that as an example of defining the criteria. That's the first step, is coming up with the profile of what the ideal partner would look like for a merger or partnership. determining how you find out who meets those criteria, and then how you're going to approach them. Are you going to pick up the phone and call them? Are you going to use a third party like us at Open Minds to contact them anonymously? There's all sorts of ways to do it. You just sort of decide what you think is going to work best for you. When you find organizations that indicate some interest, I call this the dating phase, you usually sign a non-disclosure agreement so that you can begin some discussions. I'm currently doing some work for a Mid-Atlantic provider that has signed non-disclosure agreements with about 12 organizations now, and really just doing preliminary discussions to see if there's any possibility of partnership in any way. But what the non-disclosure agreements do is they essentially keep the discussions confidential, where the individual parties agree not to share information about the other party to everyone else. I like to point out that it really doesn't take very long to figure out, once you enter into what I call the dating phase, whether or not a partnership is likely to happen. Typically, you can do this within a few months. It certainly should not take years. If you've been in discussion with organizations for years, you've probably just been toying with the notion, but not signed a non-disclosure and taken a serious look about whether a partnership, a particular merger or acquisition is likely. I point out that I like to identify early on in the dating phase whether there's any deal breakers. And this slide illustrates, just from my experience as a consultant in the industry, the kinds of things that are often deal breakers. You know, if this is going to be an actual merger, who's going to be the surviving CEO? Because don't have agreement on that, it's not likely to move forward. I've often found there are issues about the name of the surviving organization. Sometimes folks merge and keep separate names or create a family branding model or create a new name, but if the plan is to essentially have one name take over the organization, that can be a problem for the other party. So that issue needs to be addressed. And a similar issue has to do with the composition of the board of directors. Who will be the board chair and what will the composition be of a merged organization? So I'd like to get those issues as well as any other issues on the table fairly quickly, because if we can't get agreement on those, we're not likely to move forward. You know, the goal in the dating phase is not only to identify if there is a reasonable possibility of a partnership working, but also to identify what I would call the big ticket items, and this slide is just an example, that might prevent it from going forward. Because if one of those issues is intractable, then you're not going to move forward, and you could save time by simply identifying it quickly. If there is agreement that on the key issues, whatever the deal breakers are, or any of the major issues, and it looks like it's going to fit, normally folks would sign a letter of intent, and they would probably list in that letter of intent any of the major agreements that they've already made. Letter of intent usually basically says, we agree to go into due diligence for the next 60 to 90 days with the goal of coming up with a merger or partnership agreement. If at the end of that time we're not able to do that, we'll cease our attempt to do that. And then it would also list again any of the agreements we've already made. I call that the engagement phase. You know, we've made a commitment to move forward and we're moving to due diligence. The next stage is the due diligence process, and I'm going to have some more detailed slides about that, but there are essentially two goals during the due diligence process. One is to make sure there's no problems that would actually make the merger, acquisition, or partnership a bad idea. You know, you begin to due diligence with an organization and you discover that they have been fraudulently billing Medicaid for a period of time. Hopefully that wouldn't happen, but that's the kind of discovery that if you discovered it during due diligence, you would seriously consider not continuing with the partnership unless there was some resolution of that issue. So part of due diligence is really looking for, is there a problem hidden under the rocks or stones here? And that's why the due diligence process becomes very detailed, and you'll see in the coming slides. the amount of detail we go into operations, including clinical. The other key goal is to actually determine the financial feasibility of the partnership or the merged organization. That requires a bit of analysis, and I'll give you some examples of doing that. Again, due diligence process is pretty straightforward. There's a lot of steps to it, but it's pretty linear, and typically it can be completed in 60 to 90 days. You can do it on your own. You can use an outside party for parts of it, but the notion should be all the information should be summarized and presented to key deciders, including the board of directors, so that they have a very clear picture of what the findings are and any recommendations about moving forward with the partnership. That everything looks good and everyone decides to move forward, you usually actually signed a letter of intent to complete a partnership, a merger, acquisition, whatever it may be. And there may be a timeline for that. There's a lot of legal steps that are involved and other things that need to happen. But essentially, you sign a letter of intent with a specific time frame. I'm working with a customer now in Chicago that signed their letter of intent about last October. The actual acquisition in their case occurred on March 1st. So there was a number of months between the letter of intent to acquire and the actual acquisition, but it's essentially the sort of final step before you move forward in executing whatever the partnership is. And again, my examples here are primarily about merger and acquisition. So you move through the legal and other steps to complete the transaction. So I'm describing that as the process for, finding partners, going through a thoughtful process, and then a transaction occurring. Keep in mind that after this, after what I'm describing as step 6, there's still a number of steps, but they're about integration. They're about integrating our organizations and all the steps that are related to making the organization that's come together in this instance achieve all the efficiencies and benefits that are laid out as part of the strategy and the intent of the merger in this particular case. Slide, and remember, you can get a copy of all of our slides, so some of them I will move through a little more quickly. I do indicate a number of the benefits of a merger in particular. So I'm not going to read through all of them, but, obviously, as I've already discussed about, we can be expanding our geographic reach. We can be reducing our operational or unit costs by becoming larger and getting some of those efficiencies. We can make ourselves more competitive in the marketplace by having more of a market position by being a larger organization. There's all sorts of benefits that can occur. The flip side is that there are risks. Negotiations can fail. I would say certainly with the engagements I'm involved with, 40 or 50% of the discussions do not ultimately end up in a partnership. That may be just a matter of the ones that I've been working on, but certainly through a thoughtful due diligence process, you may come across some obstacles that make you not move forward. The other thing to keep in mind is even when we're talking about not-for-profit acquisitions, essentially where you're not paying to acquire an organization, there are still substantial costs involved, legal and otherwise, for looking at partnerships options in the marketplace, and that can be a challenge. Some folks actually just pick the wrong partner, or they don't get benefits that they expect after the acquisition or the partnership occurs. Some of that may be that they just aren't possible, or some of it may just be that the integration planning was just not executed in a way that achieved the outcomes that were intended. A couple slides that just have broad questions that you might really bring to your leadership or even when you're doing your planning to consider when you're thinking about merger acquisitions and partnerships. So I'm not going to read through them, but they really relate to the things we've been talking about. Are you looking for a partner? Are you looking to acquire someone and or be acquired? Where does that fit in with our organization? How will it be perceived by the outside world? What will the state, what will payers, what will our communities think if our organizations came together in some sort of way? Can we afford to do this? Do we have the resources to make this happen? And at what point in time have we brought in key deciders like the board and other folks? And will they embrace this possibility, or will they be obstacles, or will they have different opinions about it that we need to address? So there are questions that are likely to come up, but I've listed on these two slides some common questions that will either come up or need to be thought about when you're thinking about partnerships or mergers in particular. The first section was about organizational strategy and where the concept of partners fits in with strategy and certainly what's happening in the healthcare environment today, and in particularly in the New York State environment. The second piece was a little bit more about a couple approaches to finding partners, the organic approach, which is probably a bit more likely in the New York market, and then the more research planned process with the 6 steps I just described. In this section, I'd like to cover a little bit more about the detailed due diligence process. Keep in mind that the amount of due diligence that you need to do and the degree and seriousness of it is really dependent upon how close you're becoming as partners. So if you're actually merging or acquiring with an organization, it needs to be extraordinarily detailed. If you're just partnering with an organization on a small service line or contract, you probably don't need to dive into the enormous detail I'll be describing in the following slides. So to talk about due diligence, I like to talk about the key components: company information, financial information, reviewing administrative operations, and reviewing clinical operations. Through the next set of slides, and there's a number of them, I'm not going to read them all to you. Keep in mind you can pull these from the MCTAC Plus website because there's a lot of detail here. But I wanted to give you both a checklist that you can consider using if you're in the process as a starting point, and certainly seek out other advice for things to include in the due diligence process. But this is a checklist we've used at Open Minds when we're aiding organizations and either determining what steps they need to go through, or in some instances they've asked us as a consulting company to help them with some steps. So the first of the 4 broad categories is company information. Most of this is pretty straightforward. So let's imagine you've signed a letter of intent that you are planning to acquire a local provider because it fits with your organization. So you're going to want to look at obvious things, their articles of incorporation, their chart of organization, their basic financial information, leases, etc. I want to ask them about any litigation. You're always, remember, looking to see if there's problems. So have they had lawsuits against them? Want to take a look at their payer contracts. I'm doing work in the state of Kentucky where when we started to look at managed care contracts, we realized that the potential partner we were looking at had very different rates in their contracts, and that was going to have some financial impact that we needed to take a look at. Take a look at certainly key individuals in the organization, their resumes, their vitae, and find out what you need to about key employees. If they have any intellectual property or other assets, you should be taking a look at those, insurance information, key correspondence with payers, with Medicaid, with the state, with any governing agencies, those sorts of things, as well as any strategic, operational, or other business plans. Obviously, you'll want to look at the financial information. I'm going to describe that more. You really want to look at the profit and loss statements, revenues, budgets, overhead expenses, all sorts of things. If there are not-for-profit information, obviously you can pull the 990 forms and look at other information. But basically, you're trying to gather the information both to see if there's major problems, but then ultimately to do the financial projections I'll be talking about in a moment. Second broad category of due diligence is financial information. Also look at cash flows as well as bottom line and revenue issues, because that could be an issue. Certainly look at operational processes in their finance department, accounts payable, payroll, etc. Capital expenditures, take a look at all their debts and loans as well as any property owned and other sorts of things. You may need to actually recast financial statements based on any assumptions you're making, and I'll talk about that in just another moment. So this area was basic company information. The second is broad financial information, and again, I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail. You actually take a look at key administrative departments. So take a look at their finance department, the key operations there in the broad areas, billing, purchasing, et cetera. Look at their human resource department, how operations occur, documentation of how employees are hired, evaluated, disciplined, terminated. Certainly look to see if they've had any lawsuits around wrongful termination or any of those issues that may come back to bite you. If there are collective bargaining agreements in place, you'll want to take a look at those. There could be compensation agreements. Executives may have contracts for a period of time. You'll need to understand all of those in terms of evaluating the organization. Have labor complaints, workers' comp claims, what have their turnover rates been, other sorts of things that relate to human resource operations. Do they have any confidentiality or non-compete agreements in place that may be obstacles? Are there any loan agreements? And then certainly take a look at their entire benefits and compensation packages in comparison with yours, because you'll need to be making choices about how you move forward with those, whether they're both changed, whether you adopt one or the other, and what the financial impacts of those are. For administrative due diligence is quality and compliance, looking at quality management plan, corporate compliance, and any of the audits that relate to those areas. Taking a look at their technology operations, what infrastructure do they have in place, what electronic health record or other key applications are they using, what staff do they have in this department area. In addition to those four broad areas, you also need to take a look at the clinical operations. And this often involves people really taking a look at health records, medical records, and seeing what their processes are like, their documentation, interviewing clinical leadership so you have a sense of the quality of care in their clinical practices, so you know what a merged organization would look like that. We do actually recommend doing some sort of selective audit of their records. You can even use an outside party to do that in terms of both quality and compliance with any of the requirements, so that you have a good sense of what is the standing of both their clinical operations as well as their records compliance. Lastly, when you're looking at due diligence, we want to take a look at, if we put two organizations together, what would an org chart look like? So this often means making decisions about what individuals are going to remain in merged organizations, everyone or not everyone, what positions are going to remain, because obviously it affects your future planning around finances and budgeting. Certainly you need to take a look how you would integrate services. If you both offer a particular service line, are they going to be run separately? Are they going to be run together? Do you need to take a look at locations for services? Is there duplication? So really having an integration plan for your services lines as a merged or partnered organization. I mentioned the issue of board of directors in terms of composition and leadership. And then lastly, taking the time to do pro forma financial statements and projecting what the financial situation for the organization could look like going forward. And I'll give some examples of that. I've covered a lot in the last 15 minutes or so here about due diligence. As you can see, there's a lot of detailed steps, but doing it right is really critical, particularly for this degree of partnership. The thing I wanted to do before I move to some final thoughts and have time for questions is to share with you just some sample analysis materials that I pulled from various partnerships, and particularly merger and acquisition activity that I've been involved with personally. Keep in mind, the intent is not to show you something that's complete, but just to show you some snapshots of information. work with a consultant who is who was formerly CFO, and he often does financial analysis for us in terms of looking at particular mergers or acquisition opportunities. So I've listed on this slide some financial ratios he uses to determine the financial health of an organization. So many of us may not be familiar with these, but they run down the left side of the table here: the current ratio, quick ratio, days of cash on hand, etc. Definition of the ratio is the second column from the right. And for each of these, there's often a target for what is considered good. You know, what kind of cash we should have on hand, or other sorts of these. What should our management and overhead percentage be? And in this particular case, this is the actual results of a particular organizational profile he was doing. It's obviously made anonymous at this point. And he also color-coded it. Green meaning good, that they fell within the expected range. Yellow meaning that it was sort of at risk. And in this particular case, there was nothing that was coded red. But coding red means that there's a major problem with financials in terms of the particular ratio. So this is one way you can sort of profile an organization to try to address their measuring their financial health. You know, and if you pull in your CFO or even your accounting firm or other folks, they may have other things that they look at, but this is a good example of how you can use sample financial ratios, and you can actually compare them between two organizations if they're looking at coming together to see where each of them stands. On this slide, I just have an example of the quickly summarized strengths and opportunities and weaknesses and threats based on an evaluation of a particular organization that was being considered for acquisition. You know, so in this case, we were summarizing it for a board, saying, you know, the organization is fully CARF accredited. Their strategic plan already identifies the need to improve certain areas, and the organization has a well-developed service continuum. You know, on the weaknesses side, the organization was having difficulty with their EHR. Their managed care contract rates were a bit lower. And they were struggling with some of their availability and leadership around prescribers and medical doctors. So this is just a high-level summary based on an analysis that was done basically to present to some key deciders. A similar financial summary, again, just as an example, this is sort of summarizing a key indicator table that I showed a couple slides back. You know, here stating that operating cash and consistent profit through a particular time period, and that the days in outstanding and other things changed over a period of time. So again, the specifics here aren't the point here. It's about summarizing some of the analysis so that it can be presented to a board or other deciders about how you might move forward. And again, you're going to have trouble reading the detail, is just the summary page of a very detailed spreadsheet we use for the analysis of two organizations coming together in the terms of an acquisition. And essentially what we did was we took 3 previous years of financials and we combined them and showed what the organizations would have looked like if they had already been combined in the last 3 years, and then essentially showed the bottom line. And we actually projected out for 4 years what the organizations would look like if we brought them together. That was much more complicated because what you can't see on this slide is we built into it lots of assumptions that we tweak. You know, would we assume changes in staff? And if so, what would the dollar impact be in those? Were we eliminating some leadership positions? Were we making assumptions about changes in rates because one organization had better or worse rates? So we actually built into the projected financials a number of things that could be tweaked that were assumptions about changes we would make or could make, you know, growth in revenues, changes in unit rates, other sorts of things. But essentially what this does is if you look at the very bottom lines, indicates what the merged organization would look like in terms of profitability or loss. In this case, it's showing that it would have been profitable in the previous 3 years at very small margins of just under 2%. If it were pulled together with all the assumptions that you can't see but that were made as part of this, the organization would be profitable, again, at very slim profits for 3 years. But by the year 2020, it would actually operate at a negative loss, at essentially a loss of 2% unless something was changed. This is an example of doing very detailed financial projections in order to determine if a merger or acquisition could be successful. It then also drives the changes that need to occur during the integration period. So in this particular case, they made additional changes to make the numbers more profitable in the 4 years that are in blue here. But with that came all sorts of assumptions about when and what changes would occur in order for those financials to occur. So detailed in just a simple slide showing the summary, but it's a really critical part of the analysis when you're looking forward. Just a slide explaining if two organizations came together, just sort of the big picture of their geography. In this case, talking about the geographic coverage and the increase with the two organizations coming together. Another slide here just briefly describing the services coming together for an organization, some operational summary. Again, these are just examples of once the analysis is complete, you need to figure out how to put together bullet points that describe operations, geography, what the merged organization looks like, what the finances would look like, and what assumptions are attached to that picture so that people can make a decision. In this particular instance, what was presented to two board of directors was that there were essentially three possibilities. One was a full merger. The second was to selectively do some partnerships, and we came up with 3 areas of where they could partner. And the third was essentially to walk away and do nothing together. In this particular case, the actual organizations that I have changed the data a little bit here have signed a letter of intent for a full merger and acquisition. Those were helpful in giving you a sense of not only the details of a due diligence, but how you pile the information and present it to folks so that they can make a decision about whether to make a final move forward. So we move to questions. I just have 3 final thoughts for you, because you've been listening to me speak for about 50 minutes now. My first key thought is that strategy really matters. The New York State market is undergoing major changes in the coming years, so you have to have a strategy. You should have an up-to-date strategic plan where you're carefully looking at your internal capabilities, the external environment, and deciding where you're going to fit in and what you need to do to fit into that marketplace, and where the notion of partnerships and or mergers and acquisitions fit in. Explain what the opportunities are. The planning process will help identify or point you towards what may be some obvious partnerships, as well as what may be other opportunities. Clarify what you're looking for, determine what you're looking for in a partner, and figure out how to approach those folks. Then very importantly, and it was over half of my presentation, be thorough about your due diligence. Make sure you're dotting all your I's and crossing all your T's. You're looking for problem areas as well as identifying opportunities. You identify early on if there's a big obstacle to the partnership, and if so, can that be overcome? And if it can't be overcome, you stop working on that and you move on to other opportunities. And very importantly, doing the financial projections to make sure that the financial health of the partnership and or the merged organizations will be what it needs to be be competitive in the marketplace, and that then implement the integration or the partnership such that you achieve what you had planned to achieve as part of your planning process. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to my colleague, Daniela, to pull up any questions that we may have, and we'll try to answer those in the next 10 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. So folks, as Joe said, please type in your questions. We do have a couple of questions that came in during your presentation, so I'm going to get started on those. The first question is we large operating budget but need to plan for the future and make sure we're sustainable. Do you have any advice on free or low-cost resources for strategic planning?
This is where I would turn to Daniela and say, Daniela, does MCTAC or other folks, are there resources in the New York State market for pro bono work in this area? I'm personally not familiar with any. Are there folks that are aiding organizations in that way that you're aware of?
I've personally heard of some organizations that do some strategic planning work. Names off the top of my head I can't give you, but I'm happy to do some research and reach back out to the person who wrote that.
Sure. Yeah, and the other thing I have had folks do is to turn to their board of directors and see if any of their directors have connections for folks that might be able to do stuff. Because, very often our directors on our board are key folks in the community and influencers. So they may know someone who's willing to come in and do a piece or to do a planning day or do some analysis. So in addition to someone who's formally doing it, I would also reach out to our board to see if they know folks who may be able to do some pro bono work for us.
Great. Next question has to do with partnerships. The move towards value-based payment has us thinking about more and more about partnerships. Can you provide us with some tips about how to reach out to our quote-unquote competitors to start forming partnerships or agreements with them?
Okay, the question has a couple things embedded in it. I like the quote-unquote competitors, because keep in mind when we're looking at partnership opportunities, that may be looking at folks who we're typically friends with, as well as folks that we often see as competitors. And partnering with a competitor may accomplish all sorts of things. First of all, it may be a fit that works well for the marketplace, but it also eliminates a competitor. I just would point out that when we're thinking about partnerships, we should think broadly about the providers who are out there, and oftentimes someone who we consider a competitor may be an ideal partner in some instances. Now, where it's in with value-based purchasing, and many of you in New York are already dealing with it. You may be doing it, some metrics as part of the DSRIP process. I just had a call yesterday with some Westchester-based providers who are entering into more value-based contracts and the kind of metrics they need to track. Generally speaking, for anyone to be successful with value-based purchasing, you certainly need to know about the kinds of metrics that are in place for value-based contracting and be able to perform in non-fee-for-service ways because most of these contracts are paying you for delivering outcomes or performance metrics or other sorts of things. When you're looking at your partners, part of that due diligence is making sure they have the infrastructure to do the sorts of things. So often we need a very good EHR infrastructure. The call I was doing yesterday actually included a payer, and our discussions were really about making sure our electronic health record had data fields available and reporting capability so that we could report on the metrics that were part of value-based purchasing contracts, as well as the ability to manage the population that was covered under those contracts. You would also likely be looking at unit costs, because when you shift from fee-for-service to value-based purchasing, you're often looking even more closely at your cost of services, and you need to be able to manage that. Those are the things that occur to me when I'm looking at partners, particularly merger and acquisition, and I know we're shifting to value-based purchasing, are both infrastructure, unit cost, and then also just together knowing the kinds of things we need to track and whether we have the operations, both administrative and clinical, to manage successfully under those kinds of contracts. Jen, sorry, that was a long answer. Hopefully you have another question.
Good answer. That's quite all right. Thank you. We have one other question come in. Can you give some examples of how merged or acquired organizations decide on board and staff restructuring?
Oh, okay. It can be all over the map. You know, let me think of the ones I'm dealing with now. One of them I'm dealing with in Tennessee. The way that the two community mental health centers are already structured is that and I don't know if it's state mandated or just habit, but each of them has a board of directors from each of the counties that they have. So this particular merger, because it's a merger, they're going to move forward so that there is one board director for each of the counties. It does mean that one organization will end up with more directors on the new board. There was a decision made that the acquiring agency would use their board chair for the first year and that the new board would make a decision after that. So that's just one example. In other examples, it's part of the front negotiations. It's sort of the deal breaker discussions. I have a longtime friend and colleague in the Mid-Atlantic who has already done 20 or 30 acquisitions, usually of smaller organizations. What she chooses to do is she generally offers each of those organizations one board director position on her rather large board of 20 or 30 people. Again, in terms of revenues, these are small organizations, but it gives them representation. So that's been her approach. In terms of leadership, there's sort of two discussions to have here. The discussion I try to get early on is the sort of CEO senior leader discussion, because if the parties that are coming together have a clear sense of who's going to be the CEO or who's going to be the CFO or any other high-level leaders, those should be brought out at the beginning so that we make sure that there's not an obstacle there. Because if both parties think their CEO is going to be in charge in the long run, then you may not be able to move forward. So part of it is about the individual people and what you're going to do about them. I've seen instances where there's a CEO and the other CEO is hired into a different position and kept for a period of time. There's all sorts of options. Separate from that is the org chart. So it's not about the individual people, but it's about what should the picture look like. And you make decisions there, and that should be part of the due diligence about what should the org look like later once we're merged, because you can't do your budgeting and your financials unless you make those assumptions. In those instances, you're making decisions about what it should look like, and then you make decisions about how long it'll take you to get there. Maybe you're eliminating duplicate positions, but you're choosing not to eliminate them for a given period of time. Or maybe you need to eliminate one of the positions immediately in order to make the math work. Those are the kinds of back and forth decisions that are both about the picture as well as how the finances come together. Do you have time for another one?
It looks like we do not have time for another one, but I will say thank you to Susan, who chatted in that Gray Matters is a group of senior and retired volunteers who will help nonprofit organizations develop strategic plans. So thank you for that, Susan. It is 1 o'clock, so we do need to wrap up. I do want to say thank you again to Joe. You've been so great today, and I know that our audience absolutely appreciates all of the knowledge and wisdom that you have imparted upon us today. And thanks to our listeners for taking the time and participating and chatting in questions. Have a rest of your day, everyone.